Okay, so we'll go ahead.
If somebody on time is distracting us, we want to try. They got to be missed it, so we won't have class today. So,
Yeah, don't listen to her.
Okay, don't listen to her.
Now I've got to edit the video and take all this out. Yeah, it's like, okay, let's see. There's probably about, 15 seconds in? All right, chop 15 seconds off at the beginning of this. All right, so we have a couple things to finish up with the latter part of the Middle Ages before moving on to the 1400s. We call them the end of the Middle Ages, making that transition towards a more modern period. And with the arrival of a more modern period, we'll see a transformation in Christianity as well. Don't forget that the third reflection paper is due tomorrow on those writings from Aquinas. If you tried earlier, there was a mistake in the link. There should be 3 separate sections, not too long, but make sure that you look at all 3 of those sections and are addressing those in your paper. So today we finish up with talking particularly about some issues related to practice in the later Middle Ages. We've talked about mysticism and church architecture, the development of drama within Christianity, certain types of plays. There were changes as well within the practice of Christianity, in the worship services, I should say. By 800, there was a fairly formal structure in place for Christian worship in both East and West. In the West, it was the papal Mass. And so Mass refers to the worship service in which the Eucharist is taken. And so a Mass is not just a general service, it's an observance of the Eucharist. And by the 800s, it had become very formalized, involving a procession. The people presiding in the service would come forward. There was the use of special garments or robes of those participating in the service. In churches, men and women were divided, with men on one side and women in another section. But there was a very strong guidelines of what happened when. A kiss of peace related to the holy kiss, but men kissed men, women kissed women. There was the lighting of candles, the carrying of incense. And by that later Middle Ages part, congregational singing was on its way out. Instead, a choir would sing at specific times in the service. Eventually, congregational singing would, in a sense, be outlawed by the church. But at this point, it's not outlawed, it's just heavily discouraged. And even today, though there have been some changes in the Catholic worship service, Catholics in general don't have too much congregational singing. The choirs would sing predominantly psalm-type songs with names like Glory to the Father, Kyrie eleison, which means God have mercy, or Lord have mercy, glory to God on high. There would be a formulaic greeting of saying, peace be to you. Depending on what day of the month it would be, there would be a specific prayer. There would be specific readings from either the Old Testament or the New Testament that would be specific to the day in the year. There would, of course, be the service of the Eucharist, the bread being broken and given to those present. Between 800 and 1200, there were further changes. During the processional, the cross would be carried. The bishop's crown, or also called tiara, more of a royal type of procession. By the Middle Ages, the table that was used for holding the elements, right, so you putting the bread and the wine before observance of the Eucharist, became known as an altar. Right? Like you would sacrifice someone. We talk about how the sacrifice takes on those connotations of a sacrifice. But that altar this time was moved to the very front of the worship space, and the presider would do a lot of the Eucharist service with his back to the congregation. Right? And so he's up there in Latin talking, essentially the idea being he's talking to God on behalf of the congregation. And so a lot of people would just watch his back as the presider said the different prayers related to the Eucharist. By the later Middle Ages, instead of using bread, it had gone to wafers, sometimes referred to as a host. Laity, the common Christian, by the later Middle Ages, only received communion in one kind, as it was called. They only received the bread. They did not receive wine. So they only ate of the bread. They didn't drink of the cup. Most people took of the Eucharist very infrequently. It was expected they would at least take it once a year on Easter. Not only do we see these changes in the worship service, you also see the development of private masses, where the wealthy could pay for a mass service for themselves. Sometimes also held in honor of somebody who had passed on. In the Byzantine side of Christianity, the Byzantine Rite had largely been established by the early Middle Ages. There were some similarities, but also some differences. Some of the songs used were different. Also, it was more chanting, but by the later Middle Ages in the West, organs had entered the worship service. But in the Greek Church, in the Orthodox Rite, it was still a cappella music. When it came to the Eucharist for Eastern Christians, the language that was used suggested the reality of Christ's presence, but they also referred to the presence as being symbolic or mystical. And they're not talking about transubstantiation like what the Western Christians offer. Also, when the priest got to the point of the service where the Eucharist was to be given, the altar would be hidden behind a wall known as an iconostasis, because there were pictures of icons. And so there would, if you can kind of think of it, this wall of icons that separates the congregation from the altar. And then the elements would be brought out after they were blessed. No. Okay. Yeah. Church members in the Eastern Rite, including baptized infants, received communion in both kinds. And so they received both the bread and the wine. I don't think it was a matter of, well, if you're going to withhold the wine from everybody, we're going to give it to babies. I don't think there was anything like that. But you received both kinds, even as baptized infants. Part of what we see here developing with all of this is a theology of sacraments. The sacraments refer to specific practices within Christianity whereby grace was extended to the individual participating in the practice. Now, the term sacrament had been around for several centuries at this point. Tertullian had used it to refer to church practices. But by the Middle Ages, there's a very strong sacramental theology and a very precise effort to delineate what are the sacraments. In the Western Church, it was these 7. Several of them related to the life cycle, like baptism and infancy, although you could be baptized as an adult, and can still too be baptized as an adult in Catholicism. Baptism generally takes place at infancy. Later on, though, that is confirmed, right? There's that confirmation where you kind of accept your place in the community, usually some time of education preparing you for that. The age of confirmation and the age of First Communion have varied throughout Catholic history. Sometimes it's been earlier in one's life, sometimes it's been later. but usually it's that later childhood, early teen years. This is kind of like the window as to when it's kind of fluctuating. And so confirmation. As you reached adulthood, it was expected that you would either take one of two paths. You would either be married, or you would choose to live a monastic life or give your life in service to the church by being ordained. And so you would become part of one of the orders, like the Franciscans or the Dominicans that we'll talk about, Augustinians. At death, prior to your death, you would be anointed with oil, preparing you for your travels to the next life, and this was known as extreme unction. This has been changed a little bit. Now it's called anointing of the sick, and so it can be done at more times than just close to death. So those five were largely related to the life cycle. They took place at different times. Penance and communion were, like once you were confirmed, it was expected that these things would occur throughout your life. Penance, sometimes also called confession, so that term also gets used. Now it's referred to as reconciliation. The penance term is not used anymore by Catholics. But the idea was a confession of sins, and then there were certain acts you would need to do, certain prayers that you might need to say, or certain charitable deeds that you would have to do, as an exhibition of your remorse at sinning. And communion was also encouraged frequently throughout your life, throughout the year and throughout your life. But as I said, for most Catholics, it was maybe once a year, maybe twice. In the eastern part, Orthodox Christians, this was the Western list. Orthodox Christians had most of the same ones, except for confirmation. Confirmation isn't one. And they've never really said it's these seven, right? So the Catholic Church said it's these seven, this is it. But the Orthodox Christians have never officially stated that there are 7 sacraments. Another development in the later Middle Ages is the coming of age of what's known as the cult of the saints. For most people, because they didn't know Latin, because they didn't know church theology, they connected to the church through these through these people. Now we talk about how in the early church, martyrs and confessors had special privileges, or they had people had a lot of respect for them. Well, those kind of things continue on, and what you start to see are people claiming supernatural activity of these individuals, including after death. Right? That they prayed to this specific person, and healing came. And so what you have a development of is a special class of people who are conceived of as being closer to God. That they had lived extremely holy lives, and that you ask for their intercession, you request their aid, because they are so closer to God, it is more likely that those requests would be made. And so the idea being God being so high and holy, we can't go directly to Him, and so we go to someone who is closer to Him, a saint, or Mary, Jesus' mother. So there's this idea that develops of there needs to be some sort of intermediary between the common person and God. By the Middle Ages, the Papacy claimed the right to what's called canonization, right? Choosing the official saints. So you can't just refer to somebody as a saint. The church has to make that decision. In fact, just recently, last week, with the Pope's travels through the Americas, he canonized an early missionary to the Americas. Junipero Serra is his name. Often these saints would be connected with certain groups or special abilities or certain requests. So you have St. Nicholas, patron saint of sailors and fishermen, St. Jude, the saint of last resort. And so what we have by the Middle Ages is a calendar filled with feast days, observed to a specific saint, or seasons connected with various saints. So a calendar packed with moments of holiness. And of course, at the top of all these special people is Mary. And Mary is the most special of these, this specific class of individuals. A very, very important person for a lot of Catholics. Questions about worship or the cult of the saints. We're also seeing by the Middle Ages a very strict hierarchy and much more development than what we've seen before. The basic unit of Catholicism was the parish. Right? The parish was a geographic region usually connected with a lord's manor or a town. And so it's kind of, there's a region. This is a specific parish. Priests served the parishes. And in service to the parish, they did things like saying Mass, visiting the sick, engaging in religious education, right, teaching people about church doctrine. Sometimes it was also secular education, teaching people how to write, for example. The priest, depending on the size of the town, might have deacons or vicars to help with their duties. Priests by this time had to be at least the age of 30. Deacons had to be at least 25 years old. And it was expected that priests would spend at least a third of the year in residence in their parish. Several parishes were grouped together in what was known as a diocese. Most of the dioceses were based on the old Roman provinces. So how the Romans had broken up the empire, a lot of that carried over into the Catholic diocese. While priests served the parishes, bishops served and ruled over the diocese. And so the bishop was over several parishes. Bishops, as we mentioned last time, usually had a throne at one specific church, a cathedral. Usually the church in the largest town of the diocese is where the bishop was in residence. And while the bishops had originally been elected by the clergy and the people, by the Middle Ages it became the province of kings and popes, sometimes even lords of regions attempted to appoint the bishop of that diocese. Bishops were responsible for overseeing the churches in the diocese, monasteries, any sort of ecclesiastical justice, right, if somebody was charged with heresy. And it was expected that they would visit every church in the diocese at least once every 3 years. And then, of course, at the top of Catholicism sat the Pope. In the East, in the Byzantine or Orthodox Church, authority was a little bit more collegial, meaning it was shared among people as opposed to the hierarchical structure of Catholicism. Christendom for the East was broken down into 5 patriarchates, each ostensibly ruled by a patriarch. And included in that list was Rome. And so instead of looking at the Pope as the Pope, he was simply the Patriarch of Rome. Because of the status of Rome, its connection with Peter and Paul, the Patriarch of Rome was considered first among equals, but not the supreme head. Under the patriarchs were bishops, right, who oversaw the churches in various regions. For Orthodox Christians, the councils of the bishops, like the Council of Nicaea or the Council of Chalcedon, were where decisions applicable to the entire church were made. And so for the Orthodox Christians, no one bishop, no one patriarch could decide anything for the entire church. Even the patriarch, the ecumenical, worldwide, universal patriarch of Constantinople, could not make a decision for the entire church. It had to be made by a church council. And just like in the local churches of Catholicism, the local churches of the Orthodox branch had their priests who oversaw the local business. Priests in Orthodoxy could be married. Catholic priests could not. And bishops in Orthodoxy were not allowed to be married either. Right? So the priests could be married in Orthodoxy, but not the bishops. It is one of the strange things within, especially Catholicism, though, in that if priests from Orthodoxy or from Anglicanism, that we'll talk about in a couple weeks, convert to Catholicism, they can be priests even though they're already married. But if you come through Catholicism and decide to be a priest, you can't be married. And so if you come in as a priest in another communion like that, you can be a priest that's married. And so there are married priests in Catholicism, usually because they've converted from either Anglicanism or Orthodoxy. By the end of the Middle Ages, one last aspect of church practice here, or by the later Middle Ages, there's a lot of changes taking over in Europe. Development of cities, the rise of the middle class, and many Christians, common Christians, poor Christians' needs were not being met. And so you have these new religious orders, usually of monastics, who developed in order to try to meet those needs. They were called mendicant orders because they had to rely on begging or donations for funding. Now, some of these orders developed in some ways where they were completely under only the Pope's control, while other orders were under the control of a bishop or a priest. And so some of these orders had some special privileges. Two that developed during this later medieval period are the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The Franciscans were started by Francis of Assisi. Francis of Assisi is where the current Pope got his papal name, as he took it from this man named Francis. Go ahead, Jacob.
So these were houses of auto. Were they Catholic or?
These two are Catholic orders.
Catholic orders.
Right? So if you decide to become a monk, you can become a Franciscan, or you can become a Dominican.
This is kind of like a monastic way to.
Yes, it's just which kind of monk, which kind of order you want to be a part of. And usually you made that decision based on what were the kind of things that were emphasized by that order, the goals, what they specifically set out to do. Francis of Assisi grew up in a wealthy family, but he was very dissatisfied with how much wealth his family had. So he ultimately renounced that to help the poor. And so what he did was spent his time providing help to the poor, visiting the sick, as well as preaching about Jesus. Eventually, people started following him, and wanting to live and emulate him, and then also help people like he was helping people. And so eventually he got approval from Pope Innocent III to form the OFM, the Order of Lesser Brothers, or the Order of Friars Minor. So the official name of the Franciscans is the Order of Friars Minor, but they're more commonly known as Franciscans. They shared some aspects, or some things in common with other monks. They vowed celibacy, they vowed poverty, but the Franciscans did not live in monasteries. Because they traveled around begging and trying to get donations, they moved around a lot. Francis was a rather interesting individual, had a very positive view towards nature, thinking of nature as that there's a familiar connection, a brotherhood with nature and human beings. And so again, in many respects, looking at some of the things that the current Pope is emphasizing about climate control, about religious liberty, about the poor, it's no surprise he took the name Francis, because these were some of the things that Francis was concerned about. Later in life, it's claimed that he developed the stigmata. The stigmata are the reproduction of the wounds of Christ in his body. And so people claimed at various times to have this experience where Christ's wounds, from the crown of thorns, from the nails, maybe even from the side, where the spear went in, are experienced by people. The Dominicans were started by a man named Dominic, who had largely been disappointed by the church's handling of some heresies. And so he attempts to start a new order known as the Order of the Preachers. And so the official name of the Dominicans is the Order of Preachers, but they're known as Dominicans because they were started by a man named Dominic. The difference between the Franciscans and the Dominicans, one example is that Dominic emphasized the importance of study. Now, not that Francis didn't emphasize study, but his focus was on helping and helping the poor, while Dominic was the importance of studying and preaching. The Dominicans started out as a mendicant order, but later the Pope encouraged them to take property, develop a monastery, and so eventually they move away from that mendicant lifestyle. Questions about either of these mendicant orders? Let's move on then into the end of the Middle Ages. Now we're moving into, again, the 14th and 15th century. And as we move into the 14th and 15th century, we'll see more and more changes beginning to happen in society and how that affects Christianity as well, because of how tied Christianity is to Western culture, especially by this time. There are quite a few things that are going on in society that will have some very important consequences with the practice of Christianity. First is the development of a monetary economy. Now, what we're talking about with a monetary economy are things like credit. If we're seeing increases in trade, increases in the ability to manufacture. And because of this burgeoning monetary economy, you have the development of a middle class. Right? They're not the people that are involved in this are not the aristocrats. Right? They're not the nobles, the lords. They're not the very poor people. They're people that are in the middle there. Right? They're the people that are involved in trade, in production, in banking. But as the middle class develops, they start to question some of the taxes that they have to pay. They start to question who should have the real power and authority in society. And that's not just about the struggle with the aristocrats and the lords, it's also about religious authority as well. All right? And so, there's this questioning of authority that goes on. And also, a lot of the middle class in many of these places wanted to have a strong centralized government instead of these nobles ruling specific areas. And so we'll see that bringing changes as well. A second thing changing in society at this time is the development of nationalism. Many of the modern nation states we think of in Europe especially are developing at this time, which is breeding within the consciousness of people, not just a local identity, right? You live in this town. Now you start to think of a national identity. We're French, those kind of things, those kind of ideas. And usually this is also breeding a commonality amongst us against other nations. As these nations develop, each of them has a different relationship with the papacy. And some of them are very close in following the papacy. Others are questioning the Pope's authority. A third condition changing at this time is an increase in trade routes. Trade routes to the Baltics, trade routes to China. All of this, of course, bringing in other types of influences, people connecting with other groups, and bringing not only goods back to Europe and places like that, but also bringing some ideas and philosophies, texts, other things like that. At the same time, of course, Christianity going to these places, and we'll talk about that, some of the mission work done at this time. And so a lot of growth taking place, a lot of changes taking place. But on the other hand, in this time period, another big element of this development are these moments of crisis. Beginning in the 14th century, there were several moments of economic and social disruption and, of course, disease. In the early 1300s, there were several times where there were poor harvests and famine, social unrest, dissatisfaction with the nobles, and then moments of the bubonic plague. And so the bubonic plague, carried by rats, comes to the west from the east, and particularly coming from the Black Sea, and most people have no immunity to it. And the medical knowledge about it is very lacking in these places. It was called the Black Death because these black blisters would form on people. And the symptoms would appear very quickly. Loss of balance, fever, swollen lymph nodes, dementia. Many people died within 5 days of their exposure to the Black Plague. From 1347 to 1350, Europe lost 1/4 of its population, with some communities losing over 1/3. And throughout the 14th century, there were outbreaks of this every 10 to 12 years, which, of course, disrupts the economics, it disrupts the politics, but it disrupts religion as well. And so, even though we think, okay, well, this is just it's an issue of illness and disease, well, it had some important consequences on religious life as well. One aspect of the Black Plague that had an effect on religion is the large numbers of clergy that died from the Black Plague. Sometimes as much as half the clergy population in some places died. A second consequence was the revival of Joachim Fiore's views, right? The end is coming. Right? And so, this is a sign of the end times. Others looked at the Black Death as an expression of God's wrath and said that it had come because of the corruption of the church, because there was a lack of unity among people, the failure of the Crusades. All of these were pointed to by people to say, this is why this is happening to us, because God is dissatisfied. On the other hand, while some people viewed it as God's wrath, it gave other people a place to begin to doubt God's existence or God's goodness. If God truly was a loving God, why would He allow this to happen? Right? And so you have an increased skepticism that begins to take place among some people. Instead of doubt, some people turn to superstition to ward off the Black Death. A variety of magical potions, curses, charms, all of which are believed at various times to try and ward off the Black Death. And so people turning to non-Christian forms of religious practice. People went on pilgrimages, right, particularly to the Holy Land, but to other holy places, believing that somehow that would earn them religious merit by which they could escape the Black Death, be protected from the illness. The last of the religious consequences I want to talk about are the number of people that blamed the Jews for the Black Death. Apparently, the Jews did not experience the Black Death to the same measure as the Christian population in Europe. It's unclear why this took place. Some people have offered a variety of explanations. Some seem fairly reasonable. Some suggest that Jews had more cats. Right? So cats ate the rats before they beat people, and that's why they had less Black Death in the Jewish community. Maybe it's due to better sanitation practices that Jews had because they were following the law. Right? And so by following the law, they had better sanitation, and so smaller rat population, not as many people did. But it's unclear exactly why, but nobody at that time is thinking these reasons are why the Jews are escaping the Black Death. Nobody's saying, maybe it's because they have more cats. They're not because they don't understand it. It's the rats, it's actually the fleas on the rats, but there's this lack of medical knowledge. And so Jews were often accused of bringing the Black Death on the Christian population. And so people would claim they had poisoned the wells of Christians. And that's what was happening, is they were drinking this poisoned water and people were dying. And so, this assumption that Jews were somehow responsible for this. Jews would be tortured, and some Jews would actually confess to similar crimes because of the torture. Thousands of Jews were killed in Europe as part of this blaming them for the Black Plague. Some of it was fear, certainly, but there's just a lot of uncertainty about all of this. And even when several popes through this time would issue proclamations that Jews were not responsible, the mobs didn't listen and continued to blame Jews for the Black Death. In the midst of all this time period as well, there are other political things going on, like the 100 Years' War, which lasted from around 1337 to some date at 1453, some date at 1475. It has to do with the full cessation of hostilities. If you're doing your math, neither one of those dates is 100 years. It's actually more than 100 years. But it just doesn't sound good to say, well, let's talk about the more than 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War was essentially a conflict between England and France that eventually drew in some other nations as well. Largely it's about this piece of land in France that was under control of England. Right? So it's in France, but the English have control of it. So there's that aspect. And the other side, the Scots and the Welsh are trying to exert independence from England, and the French are supporting them. Right? And so there's this kind of back and forth between France and England. And also there's claims to the French throne in all of this. Right? So the King of England tries to take the French throne. And it involves several different invasions of France. There's fighting in all sorts of places, leading to breaking of treaty. The French eventually have a civil war. But in the midst of all this, the religious part, right? How does this have anything to do with Christianity? Well, I want to bring up the rather interesting experiences of Joan of Arc. Around the age of 12 or 13, Joan claimed that she was having visions and voices telling her to lead armed forces, that she should be in the army and that she should be in charge. And eventually she does leave French forces when she turns 18 and helps put the rightful French ruler back on his throne, Charles VII. And Charles has some trust in Joan. Eventually, Joan convinces Charles VII to attack Paris, which was under English control. She is wounded by a crossbow and is eventually captured by the English. She is put on trial for a couple of things. She's put on trial for dressing like a man, for communicating with angels, and for having visions. Eventually, she signs a statement that is recanting of all of that. But she's illiterate, and she only makes a cross as a symbol of her, this is how I'm signing it. But some believe that she doesn't really understand what she's signing. Eventually, the voices return, and so she recants her recanting, and kind of goes back to saying that she's receiving voices and visions from God. Eventually, she is burned at the stake by the English. For a couple of years after her death, two of her brothers attempt to pass off an impostor as their sister, and saying that she's still alive and this is her. And she would receive lavish gifts on her behalf, but the impostor eventually admits to Charles VII that this was all false. Eventually, she would be retried. She's dead. She's going to be retried. And in the retrial, she's exonerated. All right? She's declared innocent. And will eventually be declared a saint. Will be canonized as a saint of the church. Not because of her military work, but because of her intolerance of heresy. She was active in, trying to suppress heresy as well. With the economic, political, social instability going on, people often blame the church. And so even though we don't see a clear religious issue going on between France and England, all of this unrest caused people to lash out at the rulers, but then also the church, and would attack church institutions, church lands. During times of disease, some priests would flee. They would just kind of abandon their post and try to find stable places in disease. Other priests stood up to serve and attempt to relieve the suffering of people who perished. So the church is involved in all of this in very many important ways. In the East, however, things are going down for the Byzantine Empire. From the early 1300s, the Byzantine Empire was beginning to break apart. If you remember when we were talking earlier, there was a group of Muslims known as the Turks that were gradually moving into the Eastern Empire, taking control of a variety of cities and cutting east from west. The Black Death, blockades on Constantinople, makes it more and more unstable. The East tries to make some attempts at reconciliation with the West in order to gain help from the Western Empire, or the Western Church, Western Europe, to try and stop the spread of Islam that is gradually cutting its way into the Byzantine Empire. In 1438, a council of reunion occurred between the Byzantine Emperor, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Pope. So the three of these leaders meet together, and that results in the Byzantine Emperor and the Patriarch agreeing to papal primacy, that the Pope is the head of the Church, and that filioque, the statement that the Spirit proceeds from the Son as well as the Father.
Who are those three?
the Byzantine Emperor, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Pope. So they agree. They will agree with it. But when they take it back home, the rest of the people in the Byzantine Empire say, no. Right? I mean, we disagree very vehemently with this. And so the patriarchs of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria reject the decision and break off from the Patriarch of Constantinople because they cannot abide this. And so these attempts to unite to stem the spread of Islam fail. In 1451, Muhammad II begins planning the last assault on the city. The Byzantine Emperor appealed to the West. The Pope says, the only way we're going to help you is if there's reunification. There is, to some extent, Latin form of the Mass was held in the Hagia Sophia, so the Catholic Mass, but in April 1453, the Muslims lay siege to Constantinople. The city holds out until the end of May, when it is finally conquered. Questions of any of the about any of the political developments in this period?
You said the Byzantine Emperor was the Patriarch of who?
Constantinople.
Yeah, 1451.
1438 is when that council has. 1451 is when they're starting to move into Constantinople, falling in 1453. Other questions?
Constantinople fell in
1453. And eventually it'll be renamed Istanbul.
So 1455.
No, it's actually not officially renamed Istanbul until 1928. It's called Istanbul for a while, but the Muslims finally officially refer to it as Istanbul in 1928.
1492.
Yeah. 9 3/4. So we now move into talking about culture and society, some ways in which culture and society were developing. And there's still some political aspects here as well. But one of the things that's going on here is a change of relationship between the papacy and these developing nations, which we've already kind of mentioned a little bit. We'll talk about two nations specifically, England and France. In the 1000s, the Normans had conquered, beginning from the time of the Norman invasion of the Anglo-Saxons in England, England had been gradually disassociating itself from the papacy. William the Conqueror, who leads the Norman conquest, had refused to swear fealty to the Pope, refused to recognize himself as the Pope's vassal. And even some of the bishops in England found ways to avoid obeying the dictates of the Pope. And that, of course, ended up with some controversy between the leaders of England, the king, and some bishops that wanted to remain faithful to the Pope. So, for example, Anselm of Canterbury, who we talked about with scholasticism, had to flee England several times because of his allegiance to the Pope. He refused to honor the king, and he refused to allow the king to appoint bishops. Eventually, though, England would make a distinction between the bishop's rights and the king's rights. In the 1100s, there was civil war in England, which allowed the church to have some independence because the king is too busy fighting the civil war, so he is not paying as close attention to what the church is doing. But after the Civil War, the kings tried to be more involved in the matters of the church, and try to reassert some of the privileges they had before. Henry II appoints a man named Thomas of Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury, kind of the highest ecclesiastical office in England. Becket immediately champions the church's position. All right, so Henry appoints him, and he immediately goes against Henry to support the church. The king tries to force Becket to do what he wants, but he refuses. He goes into exile. With a little...
What was the king?
Henry II. The Pope tries to get involved in this because he wants England stable, and so he tries to negotiate, is there a place with mediation here between the king and the archbishop? But it doesn't work. Ultimately, Becket goes so far as to excommunicate bishops that the king appointed. All right? And so the king appoints these bishops, and Becket says, you're out of the church. Eventually, there is some reconciliation between the two. Becket returns to Canterbury, but will still not appoint his bishops. And so noblemen end up assassinating him in his cathedral. The Pope threatens Henry with excommunication and goes so far to place the section of France controlled by the English king is what's known as under interdict, meaning the sacraments cannot be performed there. Right? He doesn't do it in England, but he does it in that little part of France that England has control over, and says that in that area, priests are not allowed to do the sacraments. That means none of your kids are getting baptized, none of you are getting married by the church, and if your people are dying, they don't get oil before they die. And so, this is pretty strong religious punishment in a sense. And eventually Henry is kind of forced to do penance because of this. And eventually Becket will be canonized as a saint, right? St. Thomas of Becket. Through the latter part of the 1300s, 1400s, there are other issues between the church and the English government. When Richard the Lionhearted goes on the Third Crusade, he's gone for about 10 years, the church leaders relish their independence. Right? They don't have the king there trying to meddle in their affairs. King John was excommunicated by the Pope. Later he will become a papal vassal. This is the King John who 800 years ago signed the Magna Carta, which gave rights to the nobility and the church. But the Pope kind of disagreed with the Magna Carta and ended up, instead of getting support in England, he upset the Catholics in England. Right? They were actually supportive of the Magna Carta. England, of course, gradually moves to this more representative government known as Parliament. Right? So it's not just the monarchy. You have the House of Lords. The clergy were the Lords spiritual, and they had a voice in Parliament with other lords. Now, eventually, there would be a House of Commons, which would allow common people to have a voice in government as well. There were several attempts to control papal influence in England, and the Archbishop of Canterbury often found himself in a very difficult position, right, because of his position in England, but he's also supposed to obey the Pope. Kings were even suspicious sometimes of papal appointees to certain offices in England. And so the Pope was accused of filling these vacancies with foreigners instead of English Catholics. In France, the issue was a little bit different. The French monarchs, at least in this time, especially before 1300, were relatively weak. And so they often used their ties to the papacy to try and bring their bring stability to their rule. And of course, you have this whole thing with the King of France, right? The King of England, or the King of England. The King of England is also the Duke of Normandy. Right? And so in England, he's king. In France, he's a vassal to the King of France, who's closely allied with the Pope.
So, in a second.
Roughly at this time, we're talking about a longer time period. So it was several of those.
Is it going to be passed down from each king? It's not given to. It's not on
it's like you would pass along.
Okay.
Yeah. Throughout the latter part of the Middle Ages, France's power began to increase, and the papacy was still closely tied to it and decided to lend more and more support to France. And because of this tie between the French and the papacy, France was given some rights over the church in France that were not allowed elsewhere. Right? So the Pope allowed some things to take place in France that weren't allowed in other places. Decisions about church leaders, for example. And of course, there's a lot of struggle between England and France this time, as we talked about with the 100 Years' War. Both sides attempted to claim it was a just war, right, that just war theology we've talked about. And during it, tried to tax churches, right, tried to get funds from churches to support the war. Eventually, a man that takes the papal name Boniface VIII becomes Pope, after the previous Pope, Celestine V, resigns. One of the documents that he releases during this papacy forbids the collection of taxes from the clergy to a secular power. And so essentially he's trying to cut off this taxation of the church, getting the church's funds for the government. Well, this offends the King of France, a man named Philip IV, or also known as Philip the Fair. And so he decides that maybe the relationship between France and the papacy isn't as necessary. And so he begins to move away from the papacy. In fact, he starts supporting Boniface's enemies, right? The people that are kind of opposed to him. He will confiscate church lands, right? Appropriate them for the French government. He imprisons a bishop. And so in response to this, Boniface issues a document called Unum Sanctum, the first two Latin words of it, which translates to One Holy Church. And so this document, One Holy Church. In it, Boniface claims universal power and authority. And so as the French king is trying to assert his rights, Boniface tries to make the claim for his universal power. In it, he states there is only one Catholic Church, and outside this church, there is no salvation or remission of sins. Essentially a warning here. If you're going to go against the Catholic Church, you're not going to have your sins forgiven. You're not going to be saved. Further on, he will state, there we declare, state, divine, and pronounce, right? Got to say it 4 times to make sure it's clear, that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. Everyone has to serve the Pope. And so Boniface decides he's going to excommunicate Philip. Boniface is kidnapped. His kidnappers parade him through the town in a very humiliated state, and that will lead to Boniface's death. There's a brief successor to Boniface, but after that, the French arrange for the election of Clement V. Clement adds to the College of Cardinals 23 French Catholics. Several of them are relatives. And also decides to move the papacy from Rome to the city of Avignon in France. For 70 years, the papacy is in France, in the city of Avignon. It's been referred to by some people as the Babylonian Captivity of the church. Because sometimes popes tried to go back to Rome, but they were prohibited from going. Clement was succeeded by John the 23rd. And during John the 23rd's reign, he centralized the papacy, right? Really tried to consolidate power. But also, because of his difficult state, ended up making the Pope beholden to secular powers. And he put in place other things that allowed clerical, financial, and political abuse. Right? So he kind of sets the stage for clergy to abuse their power. He increased taxes on clergy that would go to the church and others, and 63% of the wealthy amassed went to the army in France. He was also evidently a very liberal excommunicator. He would excommunicate anybody very quickly. Later popes, after John the 23rd, would try to reform some of these things. They're not all of them. But all remained strongly tied to the French crown and thus stayed in Avignon.
Is it 22nd or 23rd?
John the 22nd, excuse me, John the 22nd. John the 23rd will appear later. After several popes, Urban V is elected to be pope in the year 1362. And he rules as pope from 1362 to 1370. Again, you don't necessarily need to know those dates. He actually travels to Rome, intending to stay there. But when he gets to Rome, he finds the people rioting and rejecting him as pope, and so he goes back to Avignon, right? Because the people don't apparently want him. In 1370, Gregory XI becomes pope, and he tries to return to Rome as well, but he too faces resistance, but ultimately makes the decision to stay in Rome. This is where the papacy belongs. There were a couple of things that the Avignon papacy contributed to, or effects that it had. First was the increases in revenue. There were new methods of financial development that brought money into the church coffers. Things like taxes, ecclesiastical gifts, many of which were quid pro quos. If I give money to the church is going to do this for me. Money from vacant dioceses went to the papacy, right? So if a bishop died and it took a while to find that bishop, any sort of money collected in that area didn't stay in the diocese, it went to the pope, which kind of was an encouragement to keep that diocese empty, right? Because that money goes to the pope. Indulgences, right? We've talked about before, this money paid so that the afterlife would be affected. It was another way that money went into the church coffers. Money was received from revenues, ecclesiastical offices being emptied, right? So increases in revenue. It also evidenced the increased power of the cardinals. The cardinals shared in the revenues that came to Avignon. And when there were fewer cardinals, of course, the share was bigger, but eventually the cardinals started to get more and more numerous. Eventually the cardinals will create a rule limiting their number, right? There can only be so many cardinals. And there were several papal attempts at trying to reform the cardinals, but they were met with resistance. With the rise of the cardinals' power, the bishop's power went down. and bishops now were only by papal appointment. The last effect, but perhaps the most profound one, is what's known as the Great Western Schism. The Great Western Schism starts with the death of Gregory XI in 1378. When Gregory died, there was some confusion. Who's going to succeed the Pope? Well, most of the cardinals by this time were French. They're concerned about their situation, and so they go to France and elect a French Pope. Rome erupts in violence. They choose, so the French cardinals choose a Pope. The other cardinals choose a man named Urban VI, who is an Italian. He rails against the authority of the cardinals and complains about the authority of the bishops. And he's trying to gain some of the papal authority that's been lost. Well, the cardinals leave Rome and decide to elect a new pope named Clement VII. So you have Urban in Rome and Clement in Avignon. Well, all the cardinals have left Urban, so Urban selects new cardinals. So you have College of Cardinals in Rome and College of Cardinals in France. Clement attacks Urban militarily, loses, goes back to Avignon. The sides are taken in Europe, right? The different countries siding with different individuals. Urban dies. So his cardinals elect a man that takes the name Boniface IX. Apparently he was kind of corrupt. There's an increase in the buying and selling of church offices during this time. And so each of these rival popes need money, so the buying and selling of church offices is, it's rampant. But with having two popes, there's this other group that's saying, okay, well, how do we fix this? Right? How do we get back to one pope? And so one of the theories is, okay, let's have both of them resign, and we'll elect a new pope. And so there's intent to negotiate between the two sides and call for a general council that will make this decision. Clement VII dies. Right? Boniface IX is the Roman Pope. Clement VII, the Avignon Pope, dies. King Charles VI of France asked the Avignon Cardinals not to elect a Pope. They don't elect the Pope, it'll solve the problem. They elect a Pope. The French king tries to encourage his people to withdraw support from Benedict XIII, who would later be declared an anti-pope. An anti-pope refers to an individual who took the name pope, but was not officially within the line of apostolic succession. Right? So the officially recognized pope during this time was Boniface IX, but contemporarily, people in France said, this is the guy, right? And the pope is Benedict XIII. When Boniface dies, Gregory XII is elected. Right? So you still have this two cardinals, two popes. And he won't meet with Benedict to try and solve the issue. Within this is the development of a conciliar movement. Right? Trying to find a council that will solve this problem. And eventually this idea turns into a belief that the council, a universal council, has more authority than the Pope, which was very similar to what the Eastern Orthodox viewed. But who can call such a council? Because neither one of these popes is going to call a council to try and solve this problem. So the cardinals decide, let's end the split and call a council. And so the cardinals call a council for the city of Pisa in the year 1409. Because of this, Benedict and Gregory both try to call rival councils. Nobody listens to them practically. Right? So everybody's looking to the College of Cardinals. In the Council of Pisa, with the support of the cardinals and the support of the European rulers, Benedict and Gregory are deposed and Alexander V is elected. If you are keeping score at home, that now gives us 3 popes.
So,
because Benedict and Gregory are not going to agree to step down from being pope.
Boniface had already died.
Boniface had died and Gregory had been elected in his place. Now, Alexander has the support of most people, but Benedict and Gregory still have some significant support. Right? So it's not like the other two suddenly lose all their support. Alexander V dies, and John, that should be 23rd, there should be an X here, another X. John the 23rd, this is where we get John the 23rd, he's elected. He will later be an anti-pope.
Right, this is after Alexander died?
This is after Alexander dies, so there are still 3 popes.
This is confusing where I'm from notes, much less living.
Another council is called the Council of Constance in 1414. John the 23rd is encouraged to abdicate. Just give up. The other 2 are deposed. Right? Gregory the 12th agrees to resign. Benedict the 13th, however, flees and goes into exile. He will eventually die without a successor. Nobody named Pope after him. And in place, Martin V is elected. And so we're now back to 1 Pope. And so all that confusion, eventually it's decided, let's convene a general council every 7 years. And that incoming popes have to promise to reform the church. So things like this don't happen. It doesn't last very long because the popes quickly disagree with it. So it ends very quickly as later troubles come up. We'll end there today. We'll pick up on Tuesday. We're talking about the Renaissance and the Renaissance's contributions to Christianity, Christianity's contributions to the Renaissance. Don't forget the next reflection paper due tomorrow.